Additionally, the co-chair, there are plans to produce policy support tools and methodologies for deliverables as follows, including scenarios and modeling of biodiversity and ecosystem services on a fast-track assessment and a guide produced by August 2015. Mr. Co-Chair, so we have the following recommendations. And I must indicate that there are a number of recommendations on biodiversity that have come across from across a wide range of interest groups. And all of these have strong support among the parties to the biodiversity-related MEAs, which include CBD, CITES, World Heritage, CMS, International Treaty for Food and Agriculture, Ramsar, and also the EPES itself, its membership. Additionally, parties to UNFCCC and UNCCD identify biodiversity as intricately linked to climate change mitigation and adaptation and land degradation, rehabilitation, and restoration, respectively. And therefore, they also ascribe to these recommendations. In brief, Mr. Co-Chair, there is the desire to develop biodiversity-related targets for SDGs related to the different determinants of human well-being, such as for food, health, water, energy, to integrate biodiversity-related issues into overarching goals, addressing broad concepts such as poverty eradication, an inclusive green economy, human well-being, and sustainable development, and also to develop a set of targets to ensure the conservation of intrinsic value of biodiversity and its role in the maintenance of the Earth's life support system as part of the Sustainable Development Goal on biodiversity and ecosystem. In conclusion, the real and pressing demands on landscape and waterscape resources for energy, food, sanitation, shelter, and other needs of the human communities will continue. We also know that it will be a real challenge to world leaders, politicians, policymakers, among several other stakeholders, to see to the fact that the unresolved issues of global concern, which include land degradation, water scarcity, and degradation of water quality, and biodiversity loss, which contribute to sustainable development, should become urgent global issues that demand immediate and effective global attention and solution. Mr. Chair, there is no denying the fact that the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020 and its 20 Aichi targets and science policy interface mechanisms can address these concerns within the biodiversity-related conventions and agreements. Biodiversity should therefore be a central component of any sustainable development goals which will emphasize on global life support systems. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Dr. Oteng Yeboah, thank you very much indeed for your very interesting presentation, and I'm particularly grateful to you for reminding us how much professional work has been done through different fora, what this group can harvest when thinking about oceans, biodiversity, forest, and other issues on our agenda today. I'm also grateful to you for your concrete suggestions regarding SDGs and targets. And now I invite Professor Virgilio Viana to take the floor. Professor Viana is the CEO of the Amazonas Sustainable Foundation, which seeks to promote the welfare and sustainable involvement of local forest dwellers throughout the Brazilian Amazon. He previously led national consultations, which led to the Forest Stewardship Council, and was founder and president of IMAFlora, the first Latin American forest certifier. Professor Viana has also served as the president of the Brazilian Society of Ethnobiology and Ethnoecology, and of the Paulista Association of Forestry Engineers, as well as vice president of the Brazilian Association of Secretaries of State for the Environment. He was a professor of forestry sciences in the Escola Superior Luis de Queiroz from 1989 to 2009. Professor, the floor is yours. We are listening to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Corossi, for the invitation. Dear delegates and guests, it's a pleasure to be here. Seeing this weather of New York, I think it's a great opportunity to bring some warmth from the Amazon here. So this picture has this intention. Just a few facts to begin with. We still have lots of forests in the world, about a third of the planet, 4 billion hectares, but we have a huge issue ahead of us, which is an alarming rate of forest loss. We're losing about 13 million hectares per year over the last 20 years, although this rate has decreased over the last years, but it's still a big issue. And it's a big issue especially because we're in the period of planet boundaries, reaching planet boundaries, as Jorn Rockström likes to call it. And forests relate specifically to two boundaries. One is loss of biodiversity, since about 80% of species are in forests. And also it relates to climate change, as something around 15% of emissions of greenhouse gases come from forests. So it is a big issue that we have to tackle with. It's also very important because of adaptation. Forests are very important in creating resilience to climate change. And oftentimes forests provide more effective alternatives to deal with the shocks associated with climate change than concrete solutions. Concrete, I mean the material, engineering type of solutions. So forests are very important also for that adaptation agenda. And in that, I should note that forest restoration will have to play a very important role in building resilience. We also have to remind ourselves that forests are very important from a social perspective. We have about over 1 billion people that depend directly on forests, over 300 million people that are among the world's poorest peoples live directly related to forests. So when we have the agenda of poverty eradication, we have also to figure forest landscapes as a very important part of that equation. And in particular, the future and the challenges that we have for indigenous peoples. Some 60 million indigenous peoples live in forest landscapes. So far, we have not been successful in halting deforestation. And part of that, and I bring my experience as a state secretary for 5 years in the Amazon, is that oftentimes environmental policies have given too much attention to regulations and laws and enforcement, and very little on the economics. And people don't deforest because they have a tendency to do illegal things, or because they're stupid, or because they're ignorant. People deforest because of an economic equation. So unless we deal with economics, we will not be able to change this current business as usual. 80% of global deforestation is driven by expansion of the agricultural frontier. And this has to be seen with the scenario of increasing population to 9 billion people by 2050 and increasing income levels as a result of reduction of poverty. So food demand is likely to increase by 70%. Where is this demand going to come from? Well, part of that is going to be new pressure for deforestation of more areas to be turned into cropland. So that's the big equation that we have ahead of us. How to deal with the need for more food while at the same time halting deforestation because we are at the tipping point of some of these planet boundaries. An essential strategy for this, and here I use the term goal, but more in the sense of the strategy, was some simple message that we formulated some 10 years ago as a key element of policy making in the Brazilian Amazon. Forests have to be worth more standing than cut. And I was glad to listen after a discussion we had with Prince Charles, him repeating this over and over again, because it's a very simple message. Unless forests are worth more standing than cut, people are not going to stop cutting. So it's the economic equation, and this little fish is called pirarucu, is a fish of the Amazon, grows up to 120 kilos, and it is one fish that is now worth more well managed than illegally harvested. So we were able to change this. So management makes economic sense. And this is a forest species because it grows on forest landscapes. We not only have to increase the value of forest products, we have to increase the value of environmental services provided by forests. And here the work of TIB, of Pavan Sukhdev, was also very important in thinking along the same lines. We have to recognize the value, demonstrate the value, and capture the value of these services that currently are not dealt with by markets. It's a market failure. I took this picture just a couple of weeks ago when I was going up the Andes, driving from the Brazilian Amazon to the headwaters of the Amazon River. And just think of this landscape compared to this previous one. What's the difference? We have a provider of a service, which is the forest. Without the forest, then water production downstream is irreversibly damaged. And with this diagram, I illustrate another environmental service, which is very important. We call these flying rivers. This is a simple description of water coming from the Atlantic River, or from the Atlantic Ocean, back to the Amazon. And then as it meets the Andes, it goes down to South America, to Bolivia, to Paraguay, to Argentina, and southern Brazil. And it turns into rain. And what is the importance of this environmental service, which also affects rainfall in Central America and in other parts of the world? It's because it feeds rivers, and rivers provide, in the case of Brazil, 70% of the energy. It comes from hydro. It is essential for food production, especially in agriculture, because most agriculture depends on rainfall. And it's essential to cities. About 70% of cities rely on rivers to supply water to their citizens. So forests provide an invaluable service. Without forests, as you saw in that earlier picture, we would be in bad shape. Well, having said all this, I'd like to give a contribution specifically on the goals. I'm a part of the SDSN, an initiative instituted by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and led by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And we produced the first suggestion of SDGs. And the number 9 is focused on securing ecosystem services and biodiversity and ensure good management of water and other resources. And here, Mr. Co-Chair, I'll just share with you some food for thought. Doesn't mean to be a complete list of targets, but I'd like to share some of those. And the number 1 is the obvious. We have to reduce deforestation and degradation of forests. And there should be a target in terms of this slope of reduction. And there should be also an agreement on when it should come to zero. Because at some point, it should come to zero. Maybe 2030, maybe earlier. We should also have other ones. I'm not going to go into the ones that are in yellow here. I'll just highlight what I think are the key ones. I'll have 4 of those. The second one is, and this number 1 is more conventional, FAO has lots of statistics on this. Number two is the most challenging one. We have to monitor the value of products coming from forests and the value of environmental services. Because if the crux of the matter is an economic one, we have to monitor how well we're doing with economics. So we have to see how successful we are in creating value to forest products, such as Brazil nuts, such as acai, just to give examples that come from the Amazon. But also we have to see how much is being used in terms of payment for ecosystem services or whatever other mechanism. I'm not referring only to market-based instruments. That could be government-led payment schemes, such as what we have in Brazil. We have the Bolsa Floresta, the Bolsa Verde, as schemes for payment for environmental services to forest dwellers. But we have to monitor how much that is being accounted for, and compare that to the other side of the agricultural frontier, which is agriculture. So how much is that compared to the GDP of agricultural production, which in the case of Brazil is about $200 billion a year? So how much are we valuing forests in relation to agricultural products? We, as forests have lots of populations which are very poor, we have to have a cross-cutting issue that deals with poverty eradication in forest landscapes, which are different from urban poor. Oftentimes people give a lot of attention to urban poor because they're more vocal. But forest poor are less vocal because they're more isolated. So we should have a separate and a distinct strategy to deal with poverty in those areas. And of course, the issues of gender and inequalities also apply to those. The fourth is one on governance. Forests have a lot of challenges in terms of governance, land tenure being one, conflicts and securing rights of indigenous peoples being another one. So we have to see how we factor in governance as one area where a lot of attention is given to, and we have to come up with the metrics for that. And here I'm thinking not only of the SDG at the international level, but also how that will have to be divided in sub-targets that will be used by governments at the national level or subnational level to monitor progress. And I'd like to finish with a view that yes, it is possible. We are running out of time, but there is still time to make forests worth more standing than cut. Thank you.
Professor Viana, thank you very much indeed for your very, very interesting, sometimes very graphic description of the situation. And thank you very much for connecting the dots. Now, dear colleagues, we have heard three very comprehensive, inspiring presentations, and I'd like to open the floor for you to engage with our speakers. Your comments, your questions, maybe your challenging remarks are very much welcome. The floor is open. I recognize Mexico asking for the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente. Muchas gracias a los panelistas y sus presentaciones. Me gustaría iniciar con una pregunta para Braulio Díaz, secretario ejecutivo de CBD, donde partiendo de que estamos convencidos de que la biodiversidad es un pilar en el desarrollo sustentable y que es más que nunca necesario humanizar a la biodiversidad, ¿cómo un objetivo de desarrollo sustentable puede ayudar a implementar el plan estratégico de CBD? ¿O cuál sería el valor agregado? ¿Cree usted que pueda aportar la voluntad política y los recursos financieros e inversión para una gestión más sustentable de la biodiversidad y los servicios que provee en beneficio de la humanidad. ¿Cómo un ODS en biodiversidad podemos superar los impedimentos del plan estratégico anterior? Eso es en cuanto a Braulio Díaz. Me gustaría también preguntar, señor presidente, a Alfred Oteng Yewab, sobre su intervención de IPBS, que recientemente ha aprobado su primer programa de trabajo para el periodo 2014-2018. Con una agenda muy interesante. Por un lado, con acciones para abordar la disminución de amenazas como polinizadores de especies invasoras. Por el otro lado, algo que consideramos muy importante es la promoción del uso sustentable de la biodiversidad y la restauración. Y por otro lado, el desarrollo de herramientas en valoración y modelaje. Ese es el primer paquete de tareas que tiene. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo un objetivo de desarrollo sustentable en biodiversidad puede ayudar a promover la generación de esta información y su uso en la toma de decisiones para apoyar la implementación del plan estratégico, así como de los diferentes acuerdos multilaterales ambientales asociados con biodiversidad? Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Let me offer the floor to Japan, addressing our speakers.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and I also thank all of the panelists for the very excellent presentations. I have two questions to Dr. Diaz and one question to Professor Viana. Firstly, to Dr. Diaz, I quite agree with you that in the sense that the biodiversity is closely related to poverty eradication, food security, health, and climate change. However, you mentioned the linkage between the cities and biodiversity, but it seems to me that that linkage is a bit weak and weaker than the other linkages with the poverty eradication and so on. So could you make a bit elaboration or clarification of the linkage between the biodiversity and the cities? The second question to Dr. Diaz is the relationship with climate change. As we all know, and in the climate change negotiation, there will be an expectation for the big agreement in the year 2015. And so from your point of view as the executive director for the Biodiversity Convention, what sort of expectation do you have for the 2015 agreement? And also, if there is a very good agreement in the year 2015 in the climate change, what sort of impact or influence will your process have? So that is the second question. And coming to the Professor Viana, and my question is, you suggested the several targets for the forests, and among them, you mentioned the notion of forest population, and I do not have any objection to this idea. However, on the other hand, it may be a bit difficult for us or for any governments to have a good data collection and also monitoring for the forest population, because it seems to me that most of the forest population are the indigenous people, and the indigenous people may be living in the forest in the very remote areas or the isolated areas. So how can you overcome that kind of difficulty for the data collection? Thank you.
Thank you much. And let me invite my good friend from Pakistan to address our speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman, I have 2 points to make. We have reached, I'm always disturbed with the camera. 2 points to make. We've reached a point in our conversation where it is important for us to get from the experts a real sense as to what is feasible and what is practical in terms of the goals and the targets that we are looking at. This debate on biodiversity, forests and oceans, and many other aspects of sustainable development are linked together. Our troika today, when we spoke, made a conceptual suggestion that we should look at ecosystem management goal, which would incorporate biodiversity, forest, oceans, and many aspects of climate change, water, food security, etc. I would like to seek some reaction from our panelists on how they visualize an integrated approach to ecosystem management, which is one of the most important issues that we would like to address. We have heard their views about goals, and I think realistically, not everything can be a goal in the framework. There needs to be integration. There needs to be coherence in our approach. So that's my first point. The second element is, Chair, on the global partnership for development. And here, all these conventions and frameworks, we know there is UNFF, we know there is a RED partnership, we know biodiversity is a convention. Oceans have their own framework. What is the added value, and I'm picking that point from our friend from Mexico, that they would like to see more specifically as a global partnership for development? What are those key elements that they would like to see reflected in as part of our conversation, as part of the conclusion that the co-chairs are very close to drawing, I must say, on, not conclusion, maybe I have gone a little bit further, but highlighting those key areas where the sustainable development goals would hinge on. I hope I can get a clear, rather more focused answers this time around for our debate to proceed from that point onwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I truly believe that the conclusions will be drawn by member states. But let me maybe ask first Dr. Diaz. Would you like to reflect on some of the questions?
Thank you. Yes. To respond to Mexico and Pakistan on the value added of including issues of biodiversity and forests and oceans in the SDGs. Well, for example, I mentioned that for biodiversity, even though we have an agreed agenda, an agreed biodiversity, and each country is fighting to incorporate these issues in their national agendas. Because we don't have an integrated approach to sustainable development policies in most of our countries, the good actions we try to implement with this hand are annihilated or destroyed by some actions we take with the other hand. So it's the problem of lack of coherence in our policies. So, for example, the Aichi target framework calls in target 2 for the incorporation of the values of biodiversity into national accounting and to incorporate biodiversity into national development policies and poverty eradication plans. Target 3 asks for the elimination or reform of all the incentives and subsidies that have negative impact on biodiversity and to increase those with positive impact on biodiversity. Target 4 calls for promotion of sustainable production and sustainable consumption policies. Well, you will agree with me that these very broad targets will not be feasible to be implemented just by the environment sectors in each country. So we need support from the other sectors. So we need finance ministries, we need the planning ministries, the ministries of agriculture, energy, etc., to really help us on these things. Otherwise, we will fail to implement the Aichi targets. And also the cost of implementing the Aichi targets will depend on whether or not governments succeed in establishing enabling policies. So currently we are trying to go uphill. So we're trying to fight the battles against deforestation, pollution, and a number of other things. So it's a battle uphill. It's very costly, difficult, because other policies in other sectors are going in the other way around. So if we can help countries to establish coherent development policies that really look at in an integrated way, the consequences of different policies for the environment, for the social security, the food security, and other issues, then the cost of implementing the environmental agenda will go down. And the feasibility of achieving these targets will increase. So these things are strongly linked to each other. The issue that Japan raised on the cities and biodiversity. The urbanization is a main process that in the next 30 years we will double the population in cities in the world. And this expansion of city will be at the cost of nature or at the cost of crop production areas. So there's a lot of potential conflicts there. On the other side, the quality of life inside our cities depend very much how we deal with the environment agenda. So we know that in many cities we have problems with violence, we have problems of lack of security, we have problems of lack of good social connectiveness in the cities. So there's a lot of recent research in the psychology sector, in the sociology sector, in anthropology, demonstrating very clearly that investments in increasing green areas, I'm talking about parks inside cities, or even green walls. If you don't have places to create parks, you can have the walls turn into green. You can plant plants. They grow on vertical surfaces. Also, so there's a lot of good literature showing that violence levels are coming down in places, in neighborhoods where they have invested in increasing the amount of green areas and the amount of physical activities of the population. So people go out more to have physical activities, and this also benefits their minds, that they feel better, so the quality of life goes up. So there's a lot of good links and reasons why we should also pay attention to the biodiversity agenda in the cities. And of course, the provision of water for the cities depend on conservation of catchment areas. The provision of food will depend on how we deal with the rural areas. So all these links are quite important. And I think the SDGs could do a good job in paying attention to these links. Thank you.
We try to do our best. It's a promise. Thank you very much. Dr. Oteng-Yeboah would like to take some of the questions, respond them.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. I'm making a reference to the idea of the assessments which the IPBES intends to do. And the concept is to be able to look at the full length of any of the gaps in knowledge on aspects of biodiversity which are still not known. There's a desire to be able to get these information. And the information may not necessarily be positive. They may be negative, but all of them will lead to some form of knowledge which will make us aware as to what to do. And therefore, coming to answer the question in which Mexico had asked about what can sustainable development goals on, say, biodiversity bring onto the platform, or bring on to our use. I think the idea is that we'll be in a better frame of mind using the science policy interface mechanism, where you will get everybody talking. And by everybody talking, I'm referring to all the stakeholders in the use of biological diversity, everyone bringing his opinion or her opinion to bear, so that at the end of the day, there is a common understanding, and that common understanding actually will relate to this idea of an integrated approach on ecosystem management. Because Many a times, it is when you lose something that you have that you realize that you have lost something. If you haven't lost it, you never think about it. But when you lose it and there's no replacement for it, then you begin to miss that which you have lost. And I believe in the process of engaging everybody in the platform discussions, when assessments reports have been brought, policymakers will be in a better shape to understand that, yes, there are these goals, these targets that have been established, particularly for the 2011-2020 strategic plan for biodiversity. But the vehicle to be able to get these plans really on the ground would be the information which they have to get to be able to take the necessary decisions, which sometimes are not available to them. So I have combined two things. I was also making a comment on the question from Pakistan about the integrated approach. And I think from the morning, when we're talking about the oceans and the seas, the same issue arose, that you cannot have discussions based on silos, but you can have, or what you should have is a discussion that moves on issues that relate to the environment in general. And so the biodiversity components within the environment may be in the forest, but if you take some forest on its own, then you are missing the thread that goes through them in terms of ecosystem service. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Viana would like to respond to the remaining questions.
Yeah, regarding the question of Japan about the data on forest populations, you're quite correct. The data is much poorer for forest populations than it is for urban populations in general. And that is something across the globe. Not only the data on how many people live in the forest, but also how they live. What is the level of education, of health, and income, and so on. It's much poor. And I think it's a good recommendation to increase and put effort on improving the data quality of forest populations so that we can have governments giving a different attention to forest peoples, not only because they have different characteristics, but also on the solutions on how to deal with the challenges that they have at the moment. Solutions in terms of education and health and income and energy and so on. Regarding the question of Pakistan, about an integrated approach, I share the views of our colleagues here in the table. And I would like to add that I think if we have the concept of services provided by in natural ecosystems, that could encompass everything. Because if we speak about forests, we may lose the focus on grasslands or on other types
of ecosystem conservation is a challenge in terms of economic development because of tourism, which contributes about 45% to our GDP in the country, and a national security because of the proliferation of small arms and other things. So I'll really appreciate hearing from the panelists how to deal with this from the demand side of it, because the demand side is the one that is really creating the problem. And can we have a standalone goal or a target that will specifically deal with poaching and illegal trade on wildlife products? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you much indeed. Now I'm recognizing Guyana asking for the floor to interact with our speakers. Just push the button. Okay.
Good. Thank you, Co-Chair. I also want to join in thanking the panelists for their presentations. I was particularly intrigued by the presentation of Professor Viana, and my delegation agrees to a large extent with the thrust of that presentation. I think the way you made your presentation, Professor Viana, it really helps us to move forward in the context of the SDGs. Because you really got at something very important in terms of linking the goals and targets to actual transformative action in sustainable development. For instance, when you spoke about the forest, in terms of how do we make that paradigm shift to ensure that we recognize the forest as having greater value standing than when they're cut. From a presentation, I got the impression that your suggestion or your approach would be in terms of using economic incentives. And again, we agree with you that really and truly, a lot of the actions around sustainable that we see are not a result because of ignorance, that people don't know the benefits and the linkages that we've been talking about. The science has been there. I mean, for instance, on forests, we've had numerous agreements over the years, but how do we get that transformative action? And I would probably pose a question to you in terms of how can we make the actions viable? And we're, of course, here speaking in the context of sustainable development goals that would be universally applicable, so that it's not going to be viable if it is, you just ask the countries, for instance, that have forests, you ask the forest people to stop cutting the forest. In many instances, this is their livelihood. This is what they depend on. It is food. It is all that they know. So how can we make those targets really viable in those situations so that it becomes there's incentive for, as you said, for them to see the sustainable development, at least for us in these areas, the ecosystem services as something that is in their interest to do. I'd be very happy to hear some more in terms of the ideas along which you were proposing earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you much indeed. I'm recognizing among us Ms. Marie-Claire Davout, Chief Sustainability Officer of Caring. Would like to address our speakers now at this point of the discussion.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and thank you to give me this opportunity. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to join you today and be able to contribute to this significant work that will contribute to all of our futures. Having originally come from the public sector, where I was in the Ministry of Ecology for the French government, and also now in my role as Chief Sustainable Officer, I have been working on the various aspects of integrating ecology and sustainability into public and private policy throughout my career. As I am sure we can all agree, we are facing enormous challenges, and the SDGs will be essential to helping chart our new way forward to meet these challenges. The private sector has a critical role to play in these. We rely on natural resources, both directly and indirectly for our business. We can build working relationships with governmental agencies. We are able to work internationally across many cultures. These characteristics mean that we can be a valuable ally in the case of sustainable development and building a green economy. Businesses like ours thrive in a society where people are thriving. Biodiversity and ecosystem underpin the very life support system that ensure human well-being and economic development. So, in this very fundamental sense, biodiversity is essential to a successful business. More specifically, we depend directly on biodiversity and ecosystem for the services they deliver as business. Caring is a group of 22 luxury and sport and lifestyle brands, including Gucci, Saint Laurent, Stella McCartney, and Puma, to name a few. Our supply chains are embedded in many diverse countries across the world. Our raw materials, such as cotton, silk, leather, cashmere, and wool, all come from agricultural systems that depend on well-functioning ecosystems that deliver water, soil fertility, and so on. Some of our products are actually made from biodiversity, like crocodile and python. And, of course, our manufacturing processes depend on water, energy, and resources. It is safe to say that along our entire supply chain, biodiversity, ecosystem, and the services they offer are essential to growing and succeeding in business. Keep in mind also these complex supply chains contribute to the livelihoods of many thousands of people and their communities. For us, maintaining functional ecosystem and protecting biodiversity is absolutely fundamental to having resilient and productive supply chains which support people, economic development, and business growth. For this reason and many others, our commitment to sustainability is built on a deep belief that embedding sustainability in the way we do our business will make us become a more successful and resilient business now and in the future.
Mrs. David, may I kindly ask if you would like to engage now with our speakers? It will be highly appreciated. Or at a later stage, there will be a possibility to deliver statements.
Okay, so it was only, and I will go without detail, to say that for us sustainability is really important, but also biodiversity, it's really important because we need biodiversity to do our business. And only to tell you that on a daily basis, we integrate sustainability. We have put in place a new tool that we call environmental profit and loss. And it measures our environmental footprint and, above all, biodiversity, not only in our operation, but also in our supply chain. And we think that it's really important that with the NGO, with the governments, and of course with all the private sector, we really take care of biodiversity, because doing like that, it's really create value for people, for community, and for the private sector.
Thank you much indeed. Delegates, may I encourage you now to take advantage of the presence of our speakers. And I recognize Bolivia who want to pose questions or put remarks to our speakers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair and friends. I would like to make some remarks and concrete questions. And I think the approach related to having ecosystems in sustainable development goals that could include other functions and elements of nature, like forests, like oceans, like land, etc., is a very interesting idea. I think that it was maybe Pakistan who suggested, and in the line of the proposal of Mr. Viana, to have an approach of integrated ecosystems that could include mountains, it could include the uses of natural resources inside the ecosystems. If we see the document, The Future We Want, we find that this is precisely the approach that the document is suggested. I have read some of the paragraphs of The Future We Want, and we have, in fact, for example, in paragraph 4, a call to maintain natural ecological processes that support food production and in the context of ecosystems. And a call to emphasize regeneration and restoration and conservation in the context of ecosystems. A call to promote integrated development in the context of ecosystems. So ecosystem is the dimension in which we have to work integrally and not to separate forests from one side, land to the other side, and biodiversity to the other side. How to put all these elements in a sustainable development goal approach. This is a challenge that you are suggesting us to think about. I would like to know from your point of view, from the point of view of the presenters, two elements. How do you think that the concepts of regeneration and restoration could be part of a sustainable development goal linked to an integrated management of ecosystem? And second, how to foster the environmental functions of ecosystems with a holistic approach and not necessarily with an economical approach. Today in the morning there was an interesting presentation about the ocean that was made of a lady who has been in the oceans for a lot of years working, and she said, let's value the oceans beyond commodities values. Strengthening and fostering the functions of the environment doesn't imply necessarily promoting the payment of ecosystem services, but to promoting complementarity and integration of productive systems in the context of the ecosystems. This is another thing that we have to discuss, and I would like to know if you can guide in a reflection in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Professor Viana would like to be the first responder of this very, very large basket of questions.
Okay, let me start backwards. So start with the Ambassador of Bolivia first. I think yes, we have to come up with ways of integrating, and I think that the concept of services provided by ecosystems is one that can be broad enough so that we incorporate all types of ecosystems. One would have to think carefully on how to deal with ecosystems which are very intensively modified, such as agroforestry. and then see where to place those, and such as intensive fish farming also. But one can put that into the agricultural side of things. In terms of valuing beyond commodities, I know very well how the Bolivian government has conceptualized the view of this challenge of creating value to ecosystems. And I would pose the conceptual analogy with the production of Brazil nuts in the forests of Pando, in Bolivia, which is a part of Bolivia. We have to make sure that, similarly to the case of Tanzania, where the poachers are not the ones that receive the value of the trade, in the case of the Brazil nuts in Bolivia, it's not the people who live in the forest that accrue most of the benefits. So we have to find ways so that people who live in the forest receive more from the products that they get out of the forest. And that applies to products as well as to services. And there are many ways of recognizing the value of these services. One can think of the simplest way, which is a cash payment, and one can think of having a special social policy, which is another way of recognizing the value of the services provided by indigenous peoples that live in the forests of places like Bolivia. So we could say, well, these people provide a service, so they deserve to have more investment on a per capita basis than people who live in the cities, because they have to be treated differently. And right now, historically, they have been receiving much, much less investment. So maybe we can flip the coin and do the opposite. By recognizing the value and by recognizing that it's more expensive to provide health and education services to those people, then we create these different ways of payment. So when I speak about payment, not necessarily it is cash. One can think of compensation in various ways. About restoration or regeneration, I think, yes, it has to be a part of the equation. That picture that I showed you of a water catchment completely deforested, that has to be restored. And restoration is very expensive. So one has to create a means of financing the work of restoration and also the incentive so that people eventually would receive from that. Costa Rica has a very nice and probably the most long-standing example of payment for ecosystem services. And they have something very, very good in terms of creating incentives for restoration of degraded ecosystems. And I think, and there are many other places around the world that have also very interesting experiences on that too. Regarding the point made by the delegate from Guyana, how to make forests worth more standing than cut. There are several instruments. I'll just highlight two. One is reduction of taxes. Instead of payment, one can say, well, let me reduce the taxes. And I say this with example of what we did in Amazonas in Brazil. At the time when we were in office, all sectors were eligible for tax incentives, but forests, because there was this idea that creating incentives to high-tech industries was good and giving incentives to forest industries was backward. And we did the opposite. So now there's zero taxes on non-timber forest products, and later zero taxes on community-based small-scale timber production. And why is that? Because it's a way that society can recognize the value of these services by not collecting taxes. One example. The other example is direct payment, cash payments, and the other is investment in social and economic programs, as I mentioned before. The case of Tanzania, how to deal with the issue, which is a big one, a very emblematic one of poaching. I think there are two sides of the equation. One is the demand side, and one can think of campaigns in countries that consume ivory, and enforcement of the existing legislation in those countries better. And then if that, one can see that there are two ways of thinking. One can say, well, let's try to eliminate demand. The other approach is say, well, this may not happen, let's deal with some of this demand. Then one can think of having some kind of management. All natural populations can be subject to management. It's a technical issue. We studied this in population biology, which is one can calculate the lambda, which is the growth rate of the population, and determine. So maybe there would be areas where you can harvest only one animal per year in the first 10 years, but eventually one can have a greater harvest of whatever natural resource. So and I'm sure that there are people who have studied a lot the demography of rhinos and elephants to come up with this. So, but the challenge is to create, like the example of the fish, the pirarucu fish, is to create that I showed in the picture, the big fish. In the case of that fish, it is now more profitable to those fishermen to harvest sustainably than to do illegally and non-sustainably, which still happens. But it's happening less and less because it's more attractive economically to do legal and managed fisheries management. So I would pose the same approach to your challenge, in addition to the issue of the demand and on how to deal with the demand. The question from UK about the number of goals and whether or not we should integrate ecosystem services into agriculture and energy and on other sectors. I think it is clear from the view that if we erode the life support system in the planet, we will jeopardize the achievements in poverty eradication and in quality of life of people across the board. So protecting biodiversity as a key element of providing ecosystem services, which are essential to life on Earth, is probably the single most important challenge. If I was to place one, it's obvious that from an ethical point of view, poverty has to come first, because there is no way that we can justify the existing poverty levels that we have right now. But other than this, I think in making sure that we don't have these kinds of erosions that I showed you, that rivers are maintained. And take the case of New York. The reason why we can go to the hotels here and drink tap water is a very simple one. The reservoir that provides water to New York, if I'm not mistaken, is called the Quabbin Reservoir. It's a forest. And the river that comes out of this forest is pure water, has zero pollution. And it's a low-cost policy, because it would have cost more to have a big plant to clean up polluted river. So it's smart to protect forests, and it's essential. And in areas like Tanzania, where we have dry areas, dry savannas, protecting the water catchment and creating incentives to protect those savannas, grasslands, miombo forests that you have there is essential. So I think it is important to have a standalone goal that speaks on the need and monitor the progress on protecting the services provided by nature.
Thank you much. Dr. Otengiba, would like to reflect on some of the questions.
Thank you. I think I will start from the question or the problem which Tanzania had raised. This is an issue which CITES, as a convention, is dealing with it. But we feel that if the overall idea of getting ecosystem services brought up as a standalone goal within the SDGs, then the convention on the CITES convention would be in a better position to enforce. You know, CITES has it's one convention that has an enforcement regime with it, and therefore, with the UN General Assembly approving through its Sustainable Development Goals to have a standalone ecosystem services as a goal, of course, then the convention will be very much empowered to deal with the issue of poaching. I'm very pleased with the comment from Bolivia making a reference to paragraph 4, because I referred to it, and that also would answer the question which the distinguished ambassador from United Kingdom asked, whether it was in our interest to have the ecosystem services as a standalone goal. When I look at the concept of regeneration and restoration, for example, I mean, if you look at an ecological system which is regenerating itself, there is life in it. And because there is life in it, there's also the perpetuation which goes around without much difficulty. But if you have a disruption, of course, the natural system, they have abilities to be able to recover. That is, if the injury or the effect is not beyond the threshold which they will be able to undergo a recovery. And so the concept, if you like, the concept of having an ecosystem conservation, regeneration, restoration, and resilience, all of these are continuous terms which will refer to a natural system which will provide for us that the lungs which will continue to be regenerated and made available for human well-being. And that, of course, will also support economic well-being and also support social well-being. I want to respond to the distinguished delegate, the ambassador of China, to do with marine issues. The question was whether IBIS would consider or considered marine issues in its deliberations for assessment. IBIS is firmly aware, and because we have this partnership with FAO and UNESCO, two UN organizations that have in part activities on the oceans, we are aware that there is this ongoing assessment, and all that we are doing is we are waiting, because IBIS is not going to do any new science. IBIS will only just catalyze the information which will be generated from such ends and make them, because our responsibility is to promote science policy interface, which means then that the information will be made in such a way available to policymakers to make the appropriate decisions which are based on science. And here I'm not referring to natural science alone, I'm also referring to social sciences, that the final product that comes out is one that is acceptable to everybody. But one thing that I wanted to talk about is, you see, poverty will always be there. Poverty has been with us all the time, and the poor will always be with us. I think the emphasis that we are bringing here is to ensure that the burden of poverty is not too much on governments to carry. And of course, when you talk of poverty, it's relative. Poverty in terms of want, or sometimes poverty in terms of plenty. That you have so much and you do not even know what to do with it. That is poverty, as far as I can understand. And so, that issue of poverty, which is also part of the end products. At the end of the day, we would like to see that people are able to utilize the kind of things that they have if they use them properly. I think it's the proper utilization of things that we want to present here. And so that's why when I say poverty will always be with us, we can also be poor in plenty. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you much indeed. It's a very interesting concept of poverty. Dr. Diaz, would like to take some of the questions which I think were directly addressed to you.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador. I'll start referring to the question posed by the UK. Certainly, we need to come up with a meaningful and reduced number of sustainable development goals that are manageable, that we can really deliver on, because we don't just want good words on the paper. We want to see results. I also think that most of you would agree that one of the problems we have with the Millennium Development Goals is that they have been implemented in silos. So each goal is implemented in an isolated fashion, and so we don't benefit from potential interactions between the different goals. So, for example, having Goal 7 on environment hasn't really helped in any way, to my knowledge, promoting the benefits of biodiversity to help solve issues of hunger, poverty, or some diseases, for example. Even though some of the existing diseases out there that we want to reduce, like malaria, is associated with land degradation or forest degradation. So I guess, as several have emphasized, having an integrated approach is perhaps the best way forward. And of course, in our issue of brief on biodiversity, we are strongly recommending that the countries agree on establishing targets related to biodiversity as input to help deliver on the goals for water, for food security, for poverty, for health, etc. However, we still also highlight that we also would benefit by having broader goals related to the enhancement of governance system and enabling policies, so we can bring the private sector towards more sustainable practices. And we also propose that it would make sense also to contemplate the possibility of a standalone goal on ecosystem. Because if you want to, for example, highlight the opportunities, as I gave the example of proposing more integrated landscape management, that would be perhaps difficult to be promoted if we didn't have, if we don't have in the end a standalone goal on ecosystems. And there are many different specific issues dealing with mountains, with forests, with wetlands, etc., that might be very difficult to take care of if we don't have a standalone goal on ecosystems. So we're not here proposing that just having a standalone goal on ecosystem would be the answer by any means. So we're just proposing this as part of a potential package. Would like to refer to one of Bolivia's question about the role of regeneration and restoration. I believe this issue should receive a lot of attention from your part to make sure that this is part of the SDGs. How can we conciliate the competing demands to increase food production on one side, to enhance availability of water on the other side, to maintain biodiversity and ecosystem services on the others? So these are potentially conflicting demands on land and on natural resources. And we have a lot of degraded ecosystems out there in the world. And there is no excuse to keep these ecosystems in their current state. So, of course, restoring a degraded ecosystem can be very costly. It depends on how you do it. If you try to do it all by plantation, it will be expensive. If you conduct or you promote natural regeneration in many places, it can be much cheaper. So there are many approaches to promote restoration of degraded lands. And again, I think that we could potentially bring the different sectors together. So looking at the potential offered by degraded lands could be part of the solution to increase food production. So part of those degraded lands could be put back to production. But part of those degraded lands should be put back to provide ecosystem services, for example, in the catchment areas. So I think that issue should receive a lot of attention from the delegates here. The issue raised by Tanzania, it's really quite a problem that we see with the current illegal trade and poaching of rhinos and elephants and many other animals. And certainly the rule of law and law enforcement is one of the answers, but certainly not the only answer. So we have a cultural problem on the demand side. We need to convince people to change their habits, their consumption habits, their food habits. That's critical, right? Maybe we could use new technologies to make available proxies, alternative materials to substitute for ivory or to rhino horns that could potentially have the same effect, I'm sure. And maybe we could subsidize that in a way that these these alternative products would be cheaper than illegal ivory and illegal rhino horns. And also we need to pay attention to the local community where these illegal trade starts. So because that's a source of income for some communities. So we should be able to also look at the needs of these local communities and find them some alternatives which can provide them some meaningful sources of income. In many of our countries, we have seen, for example, great conservation projects on marine turtles, and most of these projects are based on the fishermen that in the past were catching the turtles. Now they are conservationists. They're paid to conserve. And they like it. They prefer this than what they did in the past. So it's a matter, I think, to solve the problem raised by Tanzania, we need an approach that looks at all these aspects and not just the rule of law, even though rule of law in law enforcement is a key component. Talking about that, the representative from the private sector, Karen, raised the issue of sustainability and the importance of biodiversity. Unfortunately, many companies currently still get a lot of profit out of supply chain from unsustainable or even illegal sources or sources associated with child labor or slavery-like labor or things like that. So if the supply chain issue is not really dealt with, if the companies don't assume the responsibility for the provenance of their raw materials. So, for example, the Global Reporting Initiative, which is the major current reference for the big companies to report on environmental impacts, it calls only to assess the impacts on the main plants. It doesn't call to analyze potential impacts of the industry in their supply chain. So that's a major issue. It's a major gap that we have. Finally, the issue raised by China. The CBD parties to the CBD have a commitment to refrain or reduce activities that they conduct that might impact the biodiversity outside of their jurisdiction, be it another country or the open seas. So that's part of the commitment under the CBD. However, we currently lack a proper system of management of biodiversity in the high seas. So that's an issue that the Rio Plus 20 outcomes has called for, a protocol to be developed, and we really need to find a solution for that. You asked whether the mechanism that we have established under the CBD could be relevant. My answer is yes. For example, the Nagoya Protocol that established basic rules for access and benefit sharing out of use of genetic resources and traditional knowledge can be a very useful reference for any discussions that is taking place here in New York in the working group dealing with biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So, of course, the situation is different in the high seas, and it would be probably much more simple to find and develop a proper legal system of access and benefit sharing, so we make sure that all countries can benefit from this. On the other hand, the challenge of protected areas, that's a big challenge, protected areas in the high seas. Currently, parties have supported under the CBD the identification, the description of areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services in the oceans, both within national jurisdiction and beyond national jurisdiction. So currently we have covered 3/4 of the world with scientific assessments, and all this information is being made available to the working group here in New York, to the DUALOs, to the all those working on marine issues. And we're about to finalize this year the coverage of all the oceans. So this is an important set of information that we can provide to help solve the issue of biodiversity conservation in the high seas. Thank you.
Thank you much for your help and for your orienting materials. Before rounding up this part of the discussions this afternoon, let me recognize the representative of Major Group Women having one short question to our presenters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the Global Forest Coalition, Sobrevivencia Paraguay, and the Women's Major Group. Thank you very much for the presentation. I fully agree with the importance of ecosystems, especially also for women, and that is why we strongly support the proposal of an integrated goal covering all ecosystems. And I agree with Dr. Viana that that is probably the #1 priority goal after poverty and, of course, a gender equality goal. But we will talk more about that on Wednesday. However, you talked about making forest worth more. But one of the problems is that the activities that impact negatively on biodiversity are actually receiving far more incentives than the activities that contribute to conservation of biodiversity. And then we talk about sectors like bioenergy, large-scale bioenergy production, industrial fishing, and unsustainable livestock production, which is by far the main cause of forest loss in the continent with the highest level of deforestation on Earth, Latin America, where you and I are based. In 2012, more than $50 billion was spent on direct subsidies for the livestock industry in the OECD countries alone, while the total amount of support to biodiversity in 2010 was $6.5 billion. So in the ideal case, that would be high, up to $13 billion in 2015. So if you compare these figures, my big question is, how can we make sure that Aichi Target 3 is really integrated in the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thank you very much. Before asking our presenters, let me also encourage them that in their last response, maybe they would like to leave each and every of them with one sentence, something, the most important message what they would like to leave with this group. Who would like to start, gentlemen? Maybe Dr. Oteng-Yeboah?
One last message that I would like to leave with the working group is that biodiversity is life, and it provides all the requirements which will propel sustainable development. And therefore, when you come to be considering and narrowing the goals, I think the goal which you would put biodiversity in should be one which will reflect the global F life cycles forcibly. Because to us in the fraternity that is championing conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, we have come to the understanding that if we lose biodiversity, that will be the end of mankind.
Thank you much. Professor Viana, what would be your take, maybe on some of the answer the question and or your message to this group?
The question to the last comment is that yes, we have to find ways to create more incentives to natural ecosystems. And we should look at those sectors that have been successful in gaining support from governments. And some of this is related to lobby. So we have to lobby in a positive way, governments, subnational governments, with a simple message. Investing in protecting natural ecosystems is a good investment. It has high returns in terms of jobs, in terms of economic growth. It's not that we're saving a nice and cute species because it's endangered. It is because that species, together with many others, is essential to provide the services that are essential to us. So I think we have to make a bridge between what science tells us and what political decision makers think. We have to relate biodiversity to, eventually, to jobs and to votes and to well-being. Otherwise, we will not be able to go beyond the texts that are agreed. I think the texts are very important, but we have to make sure that these texts are translated into reality. And so far, we have not been successful because forests have been disappeared. So my last message, Mr. Co-Chair, is let's find ways to make forests worth more standing and cut.
Thank you much, Professor. Dr. Diaz, what would you like to leave with us here in this group?
Thank you. Before that, let me just also make a comment about the point raised by the representative of the Global Forest Coalition. The money to invest in biodiversity and forest conservation, restoration, sustainable use is there in your countries. You have the money, but you're utilizing the money just to privilege some sectors for some policies. So that's part of the problem, and that's what Aichi target number 3 refers to. We have to look at the how the economic instruments that we have in place in all our countries are affecting the environment. Some of them are neutral, some of them have perverse impacts, and some of them have positive impact. Currently, most of them have perverse impact on the environment, and very few have positive impacts on the environment. So there's a challenge, but also an opportunity. So the money that is currently utilized in perverse incentives, for example, for fisheries, most of the fisheries in our countries are subsidized. Our governments give money for the fuel and to renew the boats, the ships. This is paid with public money in all our countries. And this is increasing the overfishing. So that same money could be utilized in more meaningful policies for sustainability. So the money is there, and it's a matter of making good use of it. The takeaway message, I would say, pay more attention to the targets and be practical because we want to deliver. It's not good enough to have a nice target, goal, and say, oh, we will provide water for everyone, if you don't know how to deliver that. So the targets will be related to the approaches to be taken to deliver. So I think that's the critical part of the discussion. So maybe you should pay more attention to that and not just to the overall goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Dear colleagues, I think you may agree with me that our three presenters deserve a very big round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a real attention. So on behalf of all of you, I would like to thank our three presenters, excellent presenters, once again, for their wonderful contribution to our work. And now we will resume our general exchange of views on oceans, seas, forests, biodiversity. And the floor is open for statements. I'd like to remind delegations that the time allocated for one statement is 5 minutes, and it will be highly appreciated if you could observe that time frame. First, I recognize the distinguished ambassador of Benin, speaking on behalf of the LDCs.
Distinguished co-chairs, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of LDC's group. The LDCs associate themselves with a statement made by the distinguished Deputy Permanent Representative of Bolivia on behalf of the group of 77 plus China. The three themes of today's session are vitally important for the LDCs. Oceans and the seas, starting by that. The conservation and sustainable use of ocean and seas and their resources can make important contribution to poverty eradication, sustained economic growth, food security, and sustainable livelihoods, while at the same time protecting biodiversity and addressing the impacts of climate change. Besides facilitating the transportation of more than 90% of the global trade, approximately half of all international tourists travel to coastal areas. Despite huge potentials, there are increasing and complex challenges in preserving and maintaining healthy, resilient, and productive oceans for the prosperity of the present and future generations. LDCs are yet to tap the full potential offered by the seas and oceans. Lack of technological and human capacity constrains the capability to extract the mineral resources. This enables other countries to unduly draw the benefits, depriving LDCs from their legitimate endowment. In this regard, we deplore IUU fishing, and sea level is expected to continue to rise due to a combination of thermal expansion of sea waters, melting of glaciers and other snow, ice, and continued increase in groundwater extraction. The coastal LDCs are particularly affected by sea level rise, coastal flooding and erosion, and extreme events such as tsunamis and storm surges. Delta and estuaries will increasingly suffer from saltwater intrusion, siltation, and land loss. Mangroves will also be affected by the rise in sea level. An assessment of the impact of sea level rise on coastal states has revealed that the cost of adaptation could amount to 5 to 10% of GDP. However, if no adaptation is undertaken, the losses due to climate change could be up to 14% of the GDP. protection and preservation of marine environment and its living marine resources from pollution caused by all sources, including dumping of waste and toxic matters, are vitally important. In the Rio +20 outcome, states call for support for initiatives that addresses ocean acidification and the impact of climate change on marine and coastal ecosystems and resources. We need to build resilience of marine ecosystems and of communities whose livelihood depends on them. Capacity building of LDCs is particularly important to enable them to fully benefit from the sustainable development of oceans and seas and their resources. In this regard, we call for strengthened cooperation and assistance in marine scientific research, including training of personnel to develop and enhance relevant expertise, providing the necessary equipment and facilities and vessels, and transferring technology to LDCs. We also underline the need for maintaining safety and security at the sea, especially in the coastal areas of LDCs, including by addressing piracy, which needs to be treated by joint action by coastal LDCs and their development partners, by supporting capacity building of coastal states and sharing the cost of securing the territorial waters, economic exclusive zone, and the adjacent high sea. Forest, as regards forest, the LDCs has about 601 million hectares of forest land, which represent 15% of the world's total forest area. LDCs are rich in tropical forest resources, hosting nearly half of the world's tropical forests. Most of these forests are under public ownership. Forests are vitally important for LDCs, especially for maintaining the sustainability of agriculture. It protects agriculture land from erosion, sedimentation, and desertification. They also regulate nutrients and water supply. The externalities of the forest resources are extremely high. Deforestation, therefore, inflicts severe consequences on agro-production, household income, biological diversity, and the livelihood of the people depending on it. Deforestation has posed a major threat and challenge to the forest's resources and sustainable forest management in LDCs. Between 1990 and 2010, the average deforestation rate in LDCs was higher than the global deforestation rate, and most of LDCs have suffered net loss of forest cover. Factors such as high population pressure, in some cases poor land management, and economic incentives favoring agriculture cause clearing of forest land for agro-production. We need to aim at land degradation neutral agro-production. In LDCs, the formal forest sector's contribution to economy is marginal and has been on the decline. Much of the activities related to forests and trees, however, take place in informal sector and lack recognition in macroeconomic policies. Informal activities related to forests and trees, agroforestry and tree outside forests greatly contribute to the livelihood of millions of people, but they are not usually officially recorded as a contribution to the economy. Illegal logging and smuggling of valuable wood are also representing a big threat to the forest sustainability in the LDCs. All LDCs have laws and policies and strategies specific to forest government. The cross-sectoral nature of forests and trees is acknowledged in LDCs through different sectoral policies and containing provisions for forests and trees. There has been very limited foreign private sector investment related to forests and trees in the LDCs. And the countries have less than 4% of commercial plantation globally. Payment for ecosystem services scheme are often considered a potential financing source for natural resource management and provide local income and enhance conservation outcomes. However, there are only a few examples of PES schemes in LDCs, potentially due to the limited financing for covering the upfront cost to establish the mechanism. ODA is a significant source of public financing for forests in LDCs. However, this group of countries has received a very insignificant share of the global forestry ODA, and it is on the decline over the years. The forest ODA received by LDCs is only $100 million per year. It is a matter of concern that although global forest ODA has increased from approximately 400 million in 2002 to approximately 1.2 billion in 2010, LDC's share continue to remain the same or in decline over the same time. This implies that LDCs have benefited from the increase in ODA less than the other developing countries. This trend needs to be reversed. LDC must receive adequate amount of financial and technical support from the development partners. It is vitally important that the SDGs recognize the multiple benefits and interrelationship of the forest with other priority areas, with concrete goals, targets, and action at all levels. Biodiversity. Biodiversity is the source of many critical ecosystems, and there are, therefore, enhancing the conservation of biodiversity and sustainable use of resources is vitally important and can significantly contribute to the success of many climate change adaptation strategies. Further research and information is needed on the importance of biodiversity in the LDCs, its contribution to increase vulnerability, and on its potential for reducing poverty. Loss of biodiversity impacts negatively on all countries. However, the impacts are particularly severe and more immediate on the poor and vulnerable countries. Thus, the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of biodiversity are vitally important for the LDCs. Many LDCs are home to the world's biodiversity hotspots. They are also home for unique and endangered species which are frequently smuggled through international borders and are put at risk of extinction by poaching. As a result, the Convention on Biological Diversity, in its work, recognizes the special conditions of LDCs and has made a number of decisions that call for addressing issues that are pertinent and related to LDCs. These decisions prioritize support for LDCs in the administration of the Convention and the budget for its program of work, which provides funding to LDCs to attend relevant meetings and capacity building workshops. At least 44 LDCs have prepared national biodiversity strategies and action plans and equivalent instruments under the CBD as of 31st December 2010. These plans enable the identification of national strategies, plans, or programs for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. LDCs need strengthened global support to build their resilience and strengthen their adaptive capacity to deal with climate change, climate variability, and extreme weather events, and the loss of biodiversity. We are encouraged by recent decisions at the Conference of Parties of the Convention on Biodiversity, on Biological Diversity, to double the total biodiversity-related funding by 2015 and at least maintain the double sum till 2020. In the allocation of this funding, priority should be given to LDCs. The suggestion of the Secretary General's high-level panel related to biodiversity, namely to adopt sustainable agriculture, oceans and freshwater fishery practices, and rebuild designated fish stocks to sustainable level is important and deserves our positive consideration as target for biodiversity conservation and food security. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished Ambassador of Benin speaking on behalf of the LDCs. And dear colleagues, judging by the length of the list of speakers what I have in front of me, I can tell you that there is a very significant interest from all of you to share his or her ideas with the rest of the membership. So you are kindly invited to limit your interventions to 5 minutes and to post the longer versions of your interventions on the website of the Open Working Group. Having said that, I would like to offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Zambia, and to be quite precise, to the acting permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance of Zambia, speaking on behalf of Zambia and the Southern African Group, also on behalf of Zimbabwe.
Mr. Co-Chair, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Southern African Group of countries, namely Angola, Botswana, Lesotho, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, and indeed my own country, Zambia, as a contribution on this thematic area of oceans and seas, forests, and biodiversity. I wish to align this statement to the Group of 77 and China's statement delivered by the distinguished Deputy Representative, and further align it to that delivered by the LODC's representative, the distinguished ambassador from Benin. Mr. Co-Chair, I wish to thank the panelists for their presentation and also the Secretariat for the TSS briefs that are very informative. May I take this opportunity from the onset to state that the oceans, seas, and forests are important aspects of our natural resources whose contribution to the social, economic, and environmental development cannot be overemphasized. Countries in the Southern African Group are aware of the challenges posed by the climate change, desertification, land degradation, drought, flood, loss of biodiversity, management of waste and chemicals, coastal erosion, marine pollution, rising sea levels, all of which threaten the existence of small island developing states. The efforts, therefore, of the future sustainable development goals should be directed to coming up with an integrated approach to address the emerging challenges, while at the same time enhancing capacities of countries to adapt technologies, measures, and implement appropriate policies for sustainable exploitation and use of these resources. With regard to forest sector, observation has been made that the value of forests and forest products in the national economy are mostly underestimated or excluded altogether. Because of the presumed low contribution at macro level, the forest sector has not been regarded as an important element in development process of most countries in the region as compared to other sectors of the economy, such as mining, manufacturing, tourism, or agriculture. This is compounded by the fact that many forest products and services that are consumed do not enter into the market economy and are not often reported in various GDP calculations. It is therefore imperative that targets and indicators to facilitate renewed focus on sustainable development and management of forests, as well as corrective measures of its contribution of its contribution to the economy are well reflected in the framework of a future sustainable development goal. Mr. Co-Chair, countries in the Southern African Group recognize the current targets under MDG 7 are limited in nature as they do not adequately cover other important facets that forests provide and contribute to environment, economic and social dimensions. There are a number of instruments and strategies that contain a set of important and measurable indicators that the region has recognized and in some cases implementing. The indicators contained in these instruments and strategies can only be feasibly and tangibly reported if they are strengthened in the broader framework of sustainable development. Mr. Co-Chair, the region is party to most of the internationally and regionally agreed strategies and instruments whose effective implementation hinges on the future sustainable development and an inclusive post-2015 development agenda that will provide room for effective reporting on the contributions of the sector. The strategic plan for biodiversity for 2011 and 2010 has targets of halving deforestation and the loss of other natural habitats by 2020, restoration of 15% of degraded lands by 2020, sustainably managed areas under agriculture, and forestry, as well as safeguarding essential ecosystems and social equity. These targets are essential to reporting in order to enhance sustainable forest management. The current scope of targets under MDG does not adequately cover these targets and their associated indicators. Mr. Co-Chair, many countries in the region have identified inadequate technology and weak technological innovation and infrastructure capacities for sector development, apart from the need for improving policy implementation and forestry governance. These interventions could target improvements in the application of forest laws and capacity for law enforcement, establishing clear and equitable land tenure and user rights, and developing systems for monitoring performance and improving accountability at national levels. Due to the variety of sectors covered and impacted by benefits and loss of biodiversity and ecosystem, it is therefore important that biodiversity is considered as a cross-cutting issue with specific targets in different key sector goals. The group is of the view that consideration be given to issues on land use, land degradation, overexploitation of natural resources, pollution, invasive alien species, climate change, and ocean acidification. Overall, sustainable patterns of consumption and production is undermined by loss of biodiversity and the ecosystem, thereby putting the planet at risk and the function of the Earth support system. Mechanisms and integration of these matters by way of targets and indicators are important. In the light of all the pertinent issues raised, I wish to state that the region supports the proposal for a cross-cutting integrated goal focusing on sustainable development of land, forests, oceans, and environmental protection. We support the proposal that means of implementation should be an integral part of this cross-cutting goal, and we emphasize the need for support of development patterns, which is critical to adaptation and mitigation in our countries. Further, we urge that these issues be integrated into national development plans for effective implementation. I thank you, Chair, and the longer version of the statement will be posted on the website. Thank you.
Thank you much, sir. I thank the distinguished active permanent Secretary of Minister of Finance of Zambia for his statement. And now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico, the Deputy Legal Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to make a statement on behalf of his country and Peru.
Muchas gracias, señor copresidente. Y en efecto, como usted lo mencionó, mi declaración será a nombre del Perú y México. El tema que trataremos es océanos y mares. Los océanos y mares y zonas costeras constituyen un componente integrado y esencial del ecosistema terrestre y son fundamentales para el desarrollo sostenible. La Asamblea General, a través de sus resoluciones sobre océanos y el derecho del mar y la pesca sostenible, no solo vela por el desarrollo sostenible de los océanos, pero también constituyen la piedra angular para fomentar el derecho del mar, que se aplique de manera uniforme y con ello contribuya al fortalecimiento de la paz, la seguridad y la cooperación. El derecho del mar constituye el marco jurídico de la conservación y uso sostenible de los océanos y mares y sus recursos. Y es el marco jurídico dentro del cual deben desarrollarse todas las actividades de los mares y océanos. Con base en lo anterior, el camino a seguir debe basarse en los siguientes parámetros vistos desde una doble óptica. Primero, articularemos lo que los ODS deben promover, y en este sentido me referiré a tres cuestiones. Primero, priorizar el tema de la acidificación de los océanos. Priorizar el tema de la acidificación de los océanos. Acidificación de los océanos. Repito para el traductor, acidification of the oceans. Los impactos de la acidificación de los océanos, como los dijo Sylvia Earle esta mañana, el hermano terrible o el gemelo terrible del cambio climático, son de proporciones dramáticas en el tiempo. Por eso se requiere urgencia en este aspecto. Segundo, la atención de la comunidad internacional, también en el marco de los ODS, debe centrarse en la importancia de aumentar la capacidad de los países en desarrollo para poder beneficiarse de la conservación y uso sostenible de los océanos, los mares y sus recursos. Aumentar la capacidad de los países en desarrollo para conservar y gestionar de manera sostenible los beneficios de la pesca, en particular mediante un mayor acceso a mercados de sus productos pesqueros, la eliminación de subsidios, así como la sobrepesca y sobreexplotación de los recursos marinos. Del mismo modo, se requiere observar la necesidad de asegurar el acceso a las pesquerías y la importancia del acceso a los mercados por parte de los pescadores que se dedican a la pesca de subsistencia, la pesca a pequeña escala y la pesca artesanal, así como las mujeres pescadoras, los pueblos indígenas y sus comunidades. Todo ello en concordancia con el documento El futuro que queremos. Adicionalmente, y tercero, consideramos que se debe entender igualmente como prioritario las áreas en las que existen mayores oportunidades de éxito, atendiendo problemáticas asociadas a las costas y comunidades costeras. El tema de las especies invasoras, la contaminación de fuentes terrestres y fomentar prácticas sostenibles como el ecoturismo. Señores copresidentes, en este momento ahora me referiré a los temas en los que se debe tener cautela y que en este proceso y en este ejercicio debemos tener cuidado. Primero, la discusión de ODS sobre océanos, incluyendo el tema de la biodiversidad marina, no debe duplicar objetivos que ya fueron aprobados, como las metas de Aichi. Las metas de Aichi se aplican en un contexto particular, que es el propio Convenio sobre Diversidad Biológica, el cual tiene alcances geográficos y jurisdiccionales limitados. Segundo, el Grupo de Trabajo sobre Biodiversidad Marina de la Asamblea General es el foro adecuado para el tratamiento del tema. Por esto, la integración de ODS no debe prejuzgar los trabajos que se realizan en el marco del proceso establecido por la Asamblea General. Es importante reconocer que el establecimiento de áreas marinas protegidas, más allá de la jurisdicción nacional, no goza de consenso. Si se aborda de manera aislada y desarticulada de la cuestión de los recursos genéticos marinos en zonas más allá de la jurisdicción nacional. En conclusión, señor presidente, señores copresidentes, Perú y México consideramos que los ODS deben construirse sobre la base de compromisos concretos, inmensurables, de cooperación científica y tecnológica para desarrollar un uso sostenible y equitativo de los recursos marinos, a través de metas e indicadores que garanticen la mejora del bienestar humano, el empleo digno, la seguridad alimentaria y la buena alimentación. Y para concluir también, queremos reforzar la idea de que este ejercicio no debe prejuzgar procesos en curso como el de la biodiversidad marina que ya se examina en la Asamblea. Señor copresidente, esto es mi intervención sobre océanos. Tenemos una separada sobre biodiversidad y le quería preguntar en qué momento la formulamos. En este momento o en alguno que usted indique, pero estamos en sus manos sobre este punto.
May I suggest that you take another chance tomorrow, because we have still a long list of speakers who would like to take the floor also. Hopefully there will be ample time tomorrow after the panel discussion and the whole afternoon.
De acuerdo, señor copresidente, nada más le rogaría que nos incluyese en la lista de mañana. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico for his statement, and now I'd like to offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Bulgaria, speaking on behalf of her country and Croatia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, for giving me the floor. I have the honor to speak on behalf of Croatia and my own country, Bulgaria. Mr. Co-Chair, after so many interesting and exhaustive statements, comments, and presentations that we heard today, I would rather focus only on one aspect, why and how to include those issues in post-15 and development agenda, and I guess I'll be brief. When we talk about oceans and seas, forests, and biodiversity and their place in the post-15 development agenda, first and foremost, we have to find a solution to one issue: how to overcome the controversy, the conceptual divide that exists among countries with regard to the importance of the issue of environment in comparison with the social and economic ones. Bulgaria and Croatia are of the view that the solution is not to find which issue has the priority over the others, but to answer the question what is needed for the humanity in order to eradicate poverty, to achieve a sustainable development, to live a life of dignity, and to allow the future generations to live in dignity as well. This is the reason why we believe that the connection between environment-related issues such as oceans and seas, forests, and biodiversity is undeniable. This is the reason why we believe that the attention should be given to conservation and sustainable management of ocean, seas, forests, and biodiversity, since they are of a universal importance. They provide resources and ecosystem services that are crucial for the social and economic development and human well-being. Oceans and seas are not just a source of life for fishes, they are also a source of life for us, the humans. Sustainable oceans and seas mean food, energy, transportation systems, and jobs. In this sense, oceans and seas are closely related to a wide range of issues stated as central for the post-2015 development agenda. The role and the significance of the forests for human existence and development are vital. Sustainable forests mean poverty eradication, as it provides for food, energy, clean water, medicines, and fuel, as well as for the creation of jobs and livelihood. Sustainable forests means environmental sustainability, as it provides for biodiversity conservation, mitigation and adaptation to climate change, combating desertification and land degradation. Last but not least, forests are fundamental for creating green economies, respectively green industries. The third issue that we discussed today is the biodiversity. It is of crucial importance as it directly affects our lives and livelihoods. Biodiversity provides food, water, fuel, and medicine. It is fundamental to the functioning of the ecosystems, climate regulations, and provides protection against climate change impacts. Biodiversity is closely related to the poverty eradication and human well-being. Having said that, I have to underline that it is Bulgaria's and Croatia's strong belief that the key challenges on oceans and seas, forests, and biodiversity should be reflected in the post-15 development agenda. Given the importance of those issues, Bulgaria and Croatia share the view that they could be reflected as targets across multiple goals, for example, goals on food security and agriculture, water, energy, management of natural resources. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Bulgaria for her statement. And now I offer the floor to the distinguished senior advisor of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway to speak on behalf of her country, Denmark and Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And as you said, I'm pleased to speak on behalf of Denmark, Ireland, and my own country, Norway. Biodiversity encompasses the entire variety of life on Earth. It is the Earth's life support system and is vital for sustainable development. Ecosystems provide direct and indirect services that are essential for food and nutrition security, for pollination, medicines, and clean water. It is crucial for people's livelihood, not least for many indigenous peoples, and is of cultural and recreational value. Ecosystem services help regulate local and global climate and reduce the effects of climate change and natural disasters. Genetic diversity is vital for plant and animal breeding and for strengthening the resilience of agriculture to environmental stress. Loss of biodiversity makes us more vulnerable and undermines our food and nutrition security. Allowing the natural base to deteriorate at the present rate is an effective way to grind prosperity to a halt and narrow down development options. We run the risk of passing tipping points where changes in ecosystems become irreversible and the benefits they provide will be in danger. We need to consider the role of the private sector in protecting biodiversity and ecosystems. We need partnerships to engage the private sector and local communities in the sustainable management of biodiversity and the protection and restoration of ecosystems. The strategic plan for biodiversity and its 20 Aichi targets adopted under the CBD is a good basis for future action and must be implemented, and should help us integrate biodiversity and ecosystem services into the SDG framework. Mr. Co-Chair, forests host more than 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. They contribute important benefits to societies, food, raw materials, and ecosystem services. They maintain local freshwater production and regulate rainfall patterns. Resilient forests are essential for climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as for disaster risk reduction. Intact forests are of great importance to countless local communities and indigenous peoples. Around 1.3 billion people are wholly or partially dependent on forests for their livelihoods. Sustainable forest management is therefore crucial. In order to reduce deforestation and forest degradation, the underlying causes have to be addressed, such as unsustainable practices in agriculture and lack of access to sustainable energy. Community ownership of local forests must be assured, as well as support for poor communities to sustainably manage them. And then to oceans. Healthy oceans are fundamental for sustainable development. The ocean covers around 70% of the planet, and 50 to 80% of life on Earth is found under the ocean surface. Oceans host huge reservoirs of biodiversity and are characterized by complex ecosystems. Mangroves and coral reefs provide vital barriers against erosion and extreme weather. Oceans have a key role in regulating global climate and weather and water cycles. We need to protect these vital ecosystems from pollution, misuse, and overexploitation. The harvesting of marine resources contributes to the livelihood of millions of people, including for many of the world's poorest communities and people in small island developing states. Oceans are also important for production of energy and mineral extraction, for tourism and transport. All these sectors must be managed in a responsible and sustainable manner. International law, as reflected in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, provides the legal framework for the conservation and sustainable use of the oceans and their resources. Pollution from marine and land-based sources and acidification from greenhouse gases are today gradually destroying the health of marine organisms. We must step up our efforts to restore healthy marine ecosystems. Unsustainable fisheries must come to an end. We must combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and destructive fishing practices through appropriate legislation and regional and global cooperation. This is essential for the robustness of important fish stocks, other marine species, and for the livelihoods of communities dependent on them. We need to implement and further develop our tools for managing the oceans, the coastal areas, and their natural resources. A continuous interaction between marine research, modern fisheries management, and environmental best practices is the key. In conclusion, Mr. Co-Chair, we depend upon the biological resources and the ecosystem services they provide for our daily and long-term survival. Responsible management of these resources is important to sustain the basic foundation of our lives and livelihoods. We must manage our natural resources sustainably, based on the best available knowledge, the precautionary principle, and an ecosystem approach. The SDG framework should reflect and build upon this. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway for her statement. And now I offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia, speaking on behalf of her country and Guatemala. No? Then the next on my list is Belarus, if you would like to take the floor on behalf of Belarus and Serbia.
Yes, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you very much. I would like to be really brief. On behalf of Belarus and the Republic of Serbia, let me start with biodiversity. We see biodiversity as the notion in its large interpretation, which covers many issues like, among others, seas, forests, food, water, and it is absolutely clear that any setback in the area of biodiversity, which is the variety of life on Earth, adversely affects human well-being, with vulnerable and marginalized groups certainly suffering first and foremost. There is a very good reason to believe that increased attention that has been paid to this overarching issue. Indeed, we currently have in place the United Nations Strategic Plan for Biodiversity for 2011-2012, as well as relevant conventions for its component parts, like forests, oceans, and seas. Moreover, this issue featured prominently the national post-2015 consultations held in many UN member states. This all points to the need to reflect the critical role of biodiversity in the future sustainable development framework. The integration of biodiversity into the SDG framework would be facilitated by improved data and the identification of sustainable metrics, indicators and targets that link biodiversity to the various goals of the framework. In our view, biodiversity, owing to its wide scope, must be addressed through several SDGs, like, for instance, a standalone goal for forests and relevant multiple targets. Nonetheless, Belarus and Serbia remain open to review options that favor a standalone goal for biodiversity itself with appropriate targets for its various components. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus for his statement and particularly for sticking so much within the, remaining so much within the allocated time frame. So in this case, I can take one more intervention before we round up for this evening, and that may come from Switzerland, speaking on behalf of Switzerland, France, and Germany.
Mr. Co-Chair, thank you for the honor to speak the last, make the last statement today. I am speaking on behalf of France, Germany, and my own country, Switzerland. Biodiversity, oceans and seas, as well as forests, are key elements to ensure sustainable development. It was clearly pointed out by the various speakers today and by the technical support team's useful issue briefs. I will make a few comments for each of the three topics under discussion. The longer version of our joint statement will be posted on the website. Firstly, concerning oceans and seas. Oceans cover more than 70% of our planet, and a large proportion of all life is found under the ocean surface. The protection and restoration of marine biodiversity, as well as the health, productivity, and resilience of oceans and marine ecosystems is of extreme importance. Globally, all societies and economies depend on the protection, conservation, and sustainable use of marine and coastal ecosystems. They are of overwhelming importance for the economic and social development of coastal states, mainly for the developing states, including the small islands developing states among them. In our view, the following elements should be integrated into Sustainable Development Goals. Improve the health and resilience of oceans by applying the ecosystem approach, reducing sea and land-based pollution, and fighting against the chemical modification of oceans and their acidification, which is also one of the consequences of climate change. Guard coastal populations against rise of the sea level and coastal erosion by implementing integrated management of coastal zones. Enhance the safety of navigation and life at sea by addressing such issues as piracy or living conditions on board. Minimize as far as possible the impacts of maritime navigation on ecosystems. Enhance food security, biodiversity and fish stocks by sustainable management of fisheries, including eliminating illegal, unreported and unregulated fisheries based upon best available scientific data. Promote the sustainable management of mineral, extractable and genetic marine resources and fostering the development of marine renewable energies. Secondly, as regards biodiversity. Biodiversity, the variety of life on Earth, has a high intrinsic value. It is fundamental to our lives and livelihoods and essential to all dimensions of sustainable development. A new sustainable development framework should provide the enabling conditions for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, for an equitable sharing of benefits derived from the use of genetic resources, for the reduction of drivers of biodiversity loss, deforestation and forest degradation, and for sustaining associated traditional knowledge. The three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity must be reflected at the highly aggregated level in the goals and targets structure of the SDGs, and at the same time, reaching the Aichi targets must be secured by adequate targets of different SDGs. In particular, the post-2015 framework should address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, for example, by natural capital accounting and removing harmful incentives, reduce direct pressures on biodiversity and promote its sustainable use, improve biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity, enhance the benefits from biodiversity and ecosystem services, and improve access to genetic resources and, again, a fair and equitable sharing of benefits, promote the implementation of biodiversity conventions and strategies. Finally, regarding forests, sustainable forest management and responsible governance of tenure of forests promotes sustainable development that can help eradicate poverty, hunger, and malnutrition for millions of people who depend directly or indirectly on forest resources for their livelihoods. Therefore, targets should include to promote sustainable forest management as well as the integration of sustainable forest management policies in policies for sustainable management of renewable natural resources. To slow, halt, and reverse deforestation and forest degradation by addressing the direct and underlying causes of forest loss and promote reforestation, restoration, and afforestation, preferably with native species. To strengthen forest governance frameworks, including secure forest tenure and inclusiveness of decision-making. To balance between the multiple social demands to deliver products and services and the limits of the forest resources. To sustain the multiple roles and functions of all types of forests, forests and woodlands contributing to poverty alleviation and economic development of rural population, as well as to conserve and enhance carbon stock, address resilience to disaster risks and impacts, to contribute to a green economy, as well as to mitigate the adverse impact of climate change. Mr. Co-Chair, we have to ensure that biodiversity, oceans and seas, and forests are fully addressed through relevant goals, targets, and indicators, while taking into account the necessary interlinkages with other essential determinants of human well-being, in particular, issues of sustainable agriculture and fisheries, food security and nutrition, sustainable growth, health, water, and energy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland for his statement. And ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's afternoon session. We will resume our deliberations tomorrow at 10 o'clock on the subject of oceans, seas, forests, and biodiversity, with another panel discussions to be followed by an interactive exchange of views. For those member states and others who were inscribed on the list of speakers for general statements and have not yet the opportunity to speak, will have the chance to deliver their statement tomorrow, either after the interactive exchange or in the afternoon session. Having said that, unless anything urgent would come from any of you, I declare this session adjourned.